In the bleak November of 1943, the tide of the Second World War had irrevocably turned. The German army, once an unstoppable juggernaut, was bleeding out on the frozen steppes of Russia and retreating up the Italian peninsula. Amidst this crumbling horizon, Adolf Hitler turned his gaze toward the west. He knew that an Anglo-American invasion of France was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. To face this looming threat, the Führer played his most valuable propaganda card, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox, revered by his own people and feared by his enemies, was ordered to inspect the coastal defenses of Fortress Europe. When Rommel arrived in France, he carried with him the heavy burden of his reputation and the scars of North Africa. He was a commander accustomed to the fluidity of tank warfare in open deserts, yet he was now tasked with a static defense along thousands of miles of coastline. The German High Command expected him to bring a miracle, hoping his mere presence would deter the Allied planners in London. However, as Rommel began his initial tour of the fortifications along the Danish and French coasts, the illusion of German invincibility quickly dissolved. What Rommel found was not a fortress, but a facade. Nazi propaganda films had depicted the Atlantic Wall as an impregnable barrier of steel and concrete, but the reality on the ground was shockingly porous. In many sectors, the wall consisted of nothing more than scattered field works and undermanned bunkers. The artillery was often archaic, captured from defeated nations earlier in the war, and the troops were a mix of exhausted veterans from the Eastern Front and inexperienced teenagers. Rommel, known for his harsh realism, was appalled by the lethargy he encountered. His strategic assessment was immediate and contradictory to the prevailing German doctrine. The Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, an aristocratic officer of the old school, believed in a defense-in-depth strategy. Von Rundstedt argued for holding the powerful panzer divisions in reserve, well inland, to counterattack once the Allied main effort was identified. Rommel, staring out at the gray, churning waters of the English Channel, vehemently disagreed. He understood something the older generals did not: the overwhelming power of Allied air superiority. Rommel argued that once the invasion fleet appeared, the skies would belong to the enemy. Any attempt to move German armored columns from the interior to the coast in daylight would result in their destruction by Allied fighter bombers before they even reached the battle zone. The enemy is strongest while he is in the water, Rommel insisted to his staff. He believed there would be no second chance. The invasion had to be stopped at the high water mark, right on the sand. With this conviction, Rommel unleashed a whirlwind of energy that electrified the Western Front. He transformed from a simple inspector into the active commander of Army Group B, seizing direct control of the coastal zone. The sleepy occupation atmosphere vanished overnight. Rommel demanded that every hour be used for construction. He traveled incessantly, his Horch staff car becoming a familiar sight from the Netherlands to Normandy, driving his subordinates to the brink of exhaustion with demands for faster work. He approached the fortification of France with the mind of an engineer. He realized that the Allies would likely land at high tide. To minimize the distance their infantry had to run across open sand. To counter this, he ordered the construction of massive belts of foreshore obstacles designed to be submerged at high water. Steel girders, jagged wooden stakes, and concrete tetrahedrons were planted by the thousands, many tipped with mines, intended to rip the hulls out of landing craft before they could disgorge their troops. The scope of the project was staggering. Rommel set a target of laying 50 million mines along the coast, a number that seemed impossible to his supply officers. He mobilized not just the soldiers, but the local French population and the organization-tote labor battalions. Every stretch of beach was analyzed for its tactical weakness. Every dune was considered a potential machine gun nest. He ordered the flooding of low-lying marshes behind the coast to deny landing zones to enemy paratroopers and gliders, turning pastures into deadly swamps. Despite his frantic efforts, Rommel was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the coming Allies, and one against the rigidity of the German command structure. He constantly petitioned Hitler for total control over the panzer divisions, arguing that he needed the tanks dug in near the coast, ready to fire immediately. These requests were often met with compromise or delay, leaving Rommel frustrated. He knew that without the armor at the beach, the infantry in the bunkers would eventually be overrun. By the early months of 1944, the coastline had been transformed. The Atlantic Wall was no longer just a propaganda slogan. It was becoming a formidable belt of death. Yet, as the weather began to warm and the channel waters calmed, Rommel remained an anxious man. He wrote to his wife, Lucy, about the immense weight on his shoulders. He had done everything humanly possible to harden the shell of Europe, but he knew time was running out. The enemy was coming, and the race to finish the defenses was a race he was terrified he might lose. As the winter of 1944 thawed into a wet, gray spring, the coastline of northern France became the site of the largest construction project in the history of warfare. Rommel's directives had filtered down the chain of command, transforming the quiet seaside towns into industrial zones of frantic activity. The timeline was unforgiving. Allied intelligence suggested an invasion could launch as early as April, leaving the Germans with a narrowing window to turn the field marshal's blueprints into concrete reality. The strategy was no longer theoretical. It was now a desperate race measured in tons of cement and steel. To execute this colossal undertaking, the Third Reich mobilized the Organisation Todt, a paramilitary engineering group responsible for the regime's massive infrastructure projects. Thousands of uniformed German engineers descended upon Normandy and the Pas-de-Calais, supervising a vast, unwilling workforce. French laborers, conscripts, and prisoners of war were marched out to the dunes at dawn, their shovels breaking the ground where holidaymakers had once sunbathed. The sound of crashing waves was drowned out by the roar of cement mixers and the rhythmic pounding of pile drivers, a mechanical symphony that played day and night. The demand for raw materials was insatiable. The Atlantic Wall consumed concrete in quantities that drained the Reich's reserves, diverting resources from bomb shelters in German cities and fortifications in the east. Trains laden with steel reinforcement bars and high-grade cement snaked across the French railway network, constantly harassed by Allied fighter bombers. Rommel, ever the pragmatist, refused to let supply shortages halt progress. When steel was unavailable for beach obstacles, he ordered his men to scavenge scrap metal from the French interior, tearing down old tank barriers and dismantling local infrastructure to feed the defenses. The bunkers that rose from the sand were marvels of defensive engineering, standardized Regelbau designs that could withstand direct hits from naval artillery. These were not mere foxholes, but subterranean complexes complete with ventilation systems, ammunition hoists, and living quarters. Along the high bluffs, massive casemates were poured to house heavy coastal batteries, their guns pointed ominously toward England. Yet, for all their strength, these concrete giants were immovable. Once poured, they determined the battlefield, locking the German defenders into fixed positions that allowed for no retreat. Down on the tidal flats, the work took on a more sinister appearance. Rommel's obsession with stopping the landing craft resulted in the installation of the Devil's Gardens. At low tide, soldiers and laborers drove thousands of wooden poles and steel rails into the wet sand. Known as Hembakken and Cohen-Tetelements, these obstacles were positioned at varying heights to catch the keels of incoming boats as the tide rose. To make them even more lethal, pioneers strapped teller mines and captured French artillery shells to the tips, turning the surf zone into a hidden minefield waiting for the high water to conceal it. Further inland, the landscape was being aggressively altered to counter the threat of vertical envelopment. Rommel feared the Allied paratroopers as much as the seaborne infantry. In the fields and pastures behind the beaches, particularly around the Corentin estuary, he ordered the installation of Rommel's asparagus, Rommelspargel. Millions of wooden logs, cut from French forests, were planted upright in open fields and wired together with explosives. These were designed to shear the wings off gliders and impale paratroopers, denying the Allies any safe landing zones in the hinterland. The workload on the average German infantryman was crushing. The soldiers, who had expected to spend their time drilling or resting, found themselves functioning as construction workers first and combatants second. regimental commanders, complained that training schedules were being sacrificed for digging duties. Men spent 12 hours a day hauling sandbags and laying barbed wire, leaving them physically exhausted. The hands that would need to fire machine guns with precision were blistered and callous from gripping pickaxes, breeding a quiet resentment in the barracks. The construction effort was also a game of cat and mouse with the French resistance. Local workers, seemingly submissive by day, were smuggling blueprints and reports of troop movements to London by night. The Allies knew exactly where the concrete was being poured. In response, Rommel tried to prioritize camouflage, ordering that bunkers be disguised as seaside villas or buried under artificial dunes. However, the sheer scale of the work made total secrecy impossible. The scars on the French coast were visible even from high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. Despite the monumental effort, the wall remained uneven. In the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the channel where the German High Command remained convinced the invasion would come, the defenses were formidable. But in Normandy, shortages meant that gaps remained. Some gun emplacements were still open pits waiting for roofs that had not yet arrived. Others lacked the optical rangefinders necessary for accurate fire. Rommel toured these sectors with a grim expression, pointing out the vulnerabilities that remained exposed to the sea. By late May 1944, the frenetic pace began to slow, not because the work was finished, but because the materials had run out and the troops were pushed to their limit. The Atlantic Wall had grown into a jagged scar of defensive works stretching for thousands of miles, a testament to German engineering and desperation. To the naked eye, it looked terrifyingly strong. But Rommel knew better. He looked at the calendar and the tides, knowing that the structural work was done. Now the wall would have to be tested not by engineers, but by the fire of the enemy. With the physical barriers of the Atlantic Wall now etched into the coastline, Rommel turned his attention to the only force capable of delivering a decisive counterpunch, the Panzer divisions. The fortifications described in the previous chapter were the shield, but the heavy tanks were the sword. However, the deployment of these armored units sparked a fierce internal conflict that threatened to undermine the very defenses Rommel had just built. The friction between Rommel and Field Marshal von Rundstedt, previously simmering over construction priorities, now boiled over into a battle for control of the German army's most potent weapon. The debate centered specifically on the zone of death. While Rundstedt and his tank commander, General Gerd von Schweppenberg, clung to the traditional doctrine of maneuvering reserves in the open interior, Rommel argued that the rules of warfare had fundamentally changed. He pointed to the sky, insisting that Allied air superiority would paralyze any movement during daylight. The day of the dashing tank charge is over, Rommel warned his superiors. He predicted that any panzer division stationed near Paris would be reduced to scrap metal by fighter bombers long before it could reach the Normandy coast. Rommel's demand was radical. He wanted every available panzer division moved directly behind the coastal bunkers, dug in and ready to fire onto the beaches at point-blank range. In his vision, the tanks needed to act as mobile pillboxes, creating a wall of fire that would slaughter the enemy while they were still struggling in the surf. There would be no time for the tactical maneuvering Rundstedt dreamed of. The battle had to be won or lost on the water line in the first 24 hours. The disagreement escalated from tactical debates at headquarters to a bitter political struggle. Rommel, frustrated by the General Staff's refusal to adapt, leveraged his status as a national hero to bypass the chain of command. He appealed directly to the High Command, arguing that the current deployment plans were a death sentence for the Western Front. The command atmosphere grew toxic, with staff officers forced to choose sides between the pragmatic Desert Fox and the aristocratic hierarchy in Paris. Unable to broker a peace between his two field marshals, Adolf Hitler intervened from the Wolfschanz. It was a moment that required decisive leadership, but the Führer, whose grasp on reality was slipping, chose a disastrous compromise. Instead of fully backing one strategy, he split the difference. He assigned 3 panzer divisions directly to Rommel's Army Group B, but he stripped away the bulk of the strategic reserve, including the elite Panzer Lehr Division, and placed them under the direct control of the OKW, High Command of the Armed Forces. This decision created a bureaucratic nightmare. These critical reserve divisions, the heavy hammer of the German defense, were now effectively locked in a cage. Neither Rommel nor Rundstedt had the authority to move them a single mile without obtaining personal permission from Hitler himself. In an era requiring split-second reactions, the German response mechanism was now tethered to a telephone line connected to a sleeping dictator in East Prussia. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on Rommel. He had secured the 21st Panzer Division near Cannes a partial victory, but the powerful 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr remained stationed too far inland to intervene immediately. Rommel continued to plead for their release, driving to meetings with maps that clearly showed the vulnerability of the coast, but the command structure remained frozen by the compromise. As a result, the strategic coherence of the Western defense was shattered. The Atlantic Wall was a hard shell with a soft, confused center. The infantry on the beaches were preparing to fight to the death, believing that the tanks would come to their aid, unaware that the armor was paralyzed by a confusing web of overlapping authority. The compromise satisfied no one and ensured that when the invasion finally came, the German reaction would be disjointed and slow. By late May, the tragedy was set. The German army possessed the firepower to potentially throw the Allies back into the sea, but that firepower was handcuffed by its own leadership. Rommel looked at his maps with a deepening sense of foreboding. He knew that if the invasion began at dawn, the most powerful engines in the Wehrmacht would sit idling, waiting for a wake-up call that might come too late. The stage was now set for the final error. With the defenses physically ready but strategically hamstrung, and the weather in the Channel turning foul, the tension at headquarters began to drift into a false sense of security. The enemy was at the gate, the tanks were locked away, and the one man who sensed the danger was about to make a personal decision that would haunt history. While Rommel wrestled with concrete shortages and command structures, the Allies were waging a war of shadows designed to turn the German logic against itself. The Wehrmacht knew an invasion was coming, and simple geography dictated the most likely location, the Pas-de-Calais. It was the narrowest point of the English Channel, offering the quickest turnaround for shipping and the most direct route into the heart of Germany. Hitler, von Rundstedt, and the High Command were fixated on this sector, convinced that the Allies would strike where the water was narrowest. To reinforce this belief, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate deception campaign in military history. The mastermind behind this ruse was a phantom force known as the 1st United States Army Group FUSAG. On paper, it was a massive juggernaut consisting of 50 divisions, 1 million men, and thousands of tanks. To give the Ghost Army credibility, the Allies placed it under the command of the one general the Germans feared most, George S. Patton. German intelligence could not conceive that the Allies would sideline their best field commander, so his presence in Kent, directly across the water from Calais, was taken as undeniable proof that the main blow would fall there. In the fields of southeast England, a surreal theater production unfolded. Inflatable rubber tanks, wooden artillery pieces, and canvas aircraft were arranged in convincing formations. From the altitude of a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane, allowed to pass through the air defenses just often enough to take pictures, these decoys looked like a terrifying buildup of armor. The Allies created fake fuel depots, constructed dummy landing craft, and even generated tire tracks in the mud leading to nowhere, painting a picture of an army coiled to strike across the Strait of Dover. The deception extended into the airwaves. Allied radio operators generated a constant stream of fake wireless traffic, simulating the complex communications of a massive army preparing for battle. German listening posts in France intercepted orders for winter clothing, requests for specific maps of the Calais region, and chatter about wedding plans for soldiers stationed in Dover. This electronic tapestry confirmed the biases of the analysts in Berlin, who dutifully moved red markers onto their maps representing divisions that did not exist. The final piece of the puzzle was the network of double agents controlled by the British MI5. The most effective of these was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. Trusted implicitly by his German handlers, Garbo fed Berlin a steady diet of high-grade misinformation. He reported detailed sightings of the Fusag buildup, weaving a narrative that was so consistent and detailed that the German High Command stopped questioning it. They believed they had a spy in the heart of the Allied command, never realizing he was writing their defeat. The impact of this deception on the German dispositions was catastrophic. The terrifying strength of the German 15th Army, fully equipped and well-rested, was pinned down in the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. These were the soldiers Rommel desperately needed in Normandy, but they were held hostage by a ghost. Even as reports of activity in the Normandy sector drifted in, they were dismissed by High Command as a diversion, a feint intended to draw troops away from the real target at Calais. Rommel, however, was less easily duped than the staff in Berlin. He possessed a tactical intuition that made him suspicious of the obvious solution. While he acknowledged the threat to Calais, he frantically reinforced the Normandy beaches, sensing that the Allies might try to exploit the wider, softer coastline. He drove his men to flood the fields behind Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, acting on a gnawing instinct that the enemy might not do what was expected. Yet, even the Desert Fox could not completely ignore the evidence of Patton's army. He had to hedge his bets, splitting his attention between the two sectors. As May turned to June, the deception had achieved its goal. It had diluted the German strength. The Atlantic Wall was a long, thin line, and Operation Fortitude ensured that the thickest armor remained hundreds of miles away from the actual landing zones. The Wehrmacht was looking east, mesmerized by the illusion in Dover, while the real knife was being sharpened for the west. The success of Fortitude created a dangerous complacency within the German leadership. They felt they had solved the puzzle. They believed they knew the where, Calais, and they believed they had the strength to repel it. Now, the only missing variable was the when. The German meteorologists began to scan the Atlantic for storms, confident that the Allies would need perfect weather to launch such a complex operation. Thus, the stage was set for a tragedy of errors. The Germans were guarding the wrong gate. Their best tanks were locked behind administrative hurdles, and their eyes were fixed on a fake army. As the first week of June arrived, bringing with it a deep low-pressure system and violent gales, the German commanders allowed themselves to relax. The trap was not just physical, it was psychological. And as the rain began to lash against the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, the final element of a disaster, the weather forecast, was about to fall into place. By the first days of June 1944, the elaborate game of chess between the Allied deceivers and the German defenders had reached a stalemate. The armies were positioned, the tanks were fueling, and the spies had done their work. However, as the calendar turned, a new and uncontrollable player entered the theater: the North Atlantic weather. For months, military planners on both sides had studied the phases of the moon and the tidal charts, knowing that an invasion required a precise alignment of conditions. But nature, it seemed, had no intention of cooperating. Deep in the Atlantic Ocean, a massive low-pressure system was forming, churning with an intensity rarely seen in late spring. This atmospheric depression began to barrel toward the English Channel, pushing ahead of it a wall of wind and rain. To the German commanders looking out from their coastal bunkers, the horizon turned a bruised purple, and the sea, usually a rhythmic presence, transformed into a chaotic fury. The calm waters required for flat-bottomed landing craft to navigate were replaced by 6-foot swells and crashing whitecaps. The German Meteorological Service, the Luftwaffe Wetterdienst, watched the barometer drop with a mixture of professional concern and strategic relief. Unlike the Allies, who had a vast network of weather stations in Greenland, Iceland, and ships scattered across the Atlantic, the Germans were flying blind. They had lost their weather ships and secret stations earlier in the war, meaning their ability to predict incoming fronts was limited to what they could observe over the continent and the immediate coast. They could see the storm hitting them, but they could not see the subtle breaks behind it. For the soldiers manning the machine gun nests along Omaha and Utah beaches, the storm was miserable but reassuring. The wind whipped sand into their eyes, and the rain flooded the trenches. But every gale force gust felt like a reprieve. The standing orders for the invasion defense stated clearly that the enemy would need a full moon for visibility and low tide to spot the beach obstacles. While the tides were right, the cloud cover was thick and impenetrable, and the sea state was borderline suicidal for any amphibious force. On June 4th, the storm reached its peak. Gale force winds lashed the Normandy coast, bending the poplars double and stripping shingles off the roofs of French farmhouses. In the harbors of Cherbourg and Le Havre, the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, made a practical decision. Admiral Theodor Krank, convinced that no fleet could operate in such turbulence, canceled all scheduled E-boat patrols. The mine layers and patrol boats remained tied to the docks, bobbing violently in the safety of the breakwaters. The channel was effectively abandoned to the elements. The Luftwaffe followed suit. The airfield commanders, looking at the rain sheeting sideways across the runways, grounded their reconnaissance planes. There would be no patrols over the channel to spot an approaching fleet, but the logic held that there was nothing to spot. The German command reasoned that the Allies were not madmen. To launch an invasion force of thousands of ships into the teeth of a Force 5 gale would be a military catastrophe before a single shot was fired. Inside the headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, the mood shifted from high tension to a relaxed operational pause. The storm acted as a natural shield, far more effective than any concrete wall or minefield. The officers began to catch up on sleep, the staff work slowed, and the rigid alertness that had defined the spring began to soften. The prevailing wisdom was that the invasion window for June had been missed. If the Allies didn't come now, during the favorable tides, they would have to wait weeks for the next alignment of moon and water. Rommel himself looked out at the swaying trees in the park of the castle and felt a similar sense of certainty. He had spent months in a state of hypervigilance, driving himself to the brink of exhaustion. Now, the howling wind sang a lullaby of safety. He believed he had been granted a timeout by nature itself, a few days where the war could not touch the coast of France. This false security seeped down through every rank, from the high command in Berchtesgaden to the lowliest private in a damp foxhole. The Wehrmacht collectively exhaled. They believed they were fighting the Allies, but in these critical hours, they were fighting their own assumptions. They assumed the enemy would act with perfect caution, waiting for the perfect day. They did not calculate that the storm might be the very cloak the enemy was using to hide the knife. As the night of June 4th closed in, the storm continued to rage, rattling the shutters of the villas commandeered by the German officers. The Atlantic wall was battered by wind and water, secure in its isolation. The great invasion scare of 1944 seemed to be over for the moment. It was, the Germans concluded, the perfect time to take a break, to attend to personal matters, and to perhaps leave the front for a few days. The weather had decided the schedule, or so they thought. On the morning of June 4th, 1944, the atmosphere inside the Duc de la Rochefoucauld's castle at La Roche-Guyon was heavy with cigarette smoke and the smell of damp wool. While the gale rattled the tall windows of the headquarters, the chief meteorologist for Army Group B, Major Leto, prepared to deliver the daily briefing. This was the most anticipated moment of the morning routine. In a command center blind to enemy troop movements, the weather forecast had become the primary form of intelligence. Rommel and his chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, waited for the verdict that would dictate the rhythm of the war for the next few days. Leto's report was definitive and, to the German commanders, scientifically reassuring. He unfolded the charts showing the gross weatherage, the large-scale weather situation. The data indicated a deep, stabilizing depression centered over the North Sea, with a secondary front moving in from the Atlantic. According to the German analysis, the current storm system was not merely passing through, it was settling in. The forecast predicted gale force winds, low cloud ceilings, and rain continuing without cessation until at least June 8th. The tragedy of this report lay not in the competence of the German meteorologists, but in their blindness. The Wehrmacht had lost the weather war years prior, when the Allies eliminated their weather ships and automated buoys in the Atlantic. Leto and his team were interpreting data solely from land-based stations in Europe. They could see the storm that was currently battering them, but they were blind to the weather forming 1,000 miles out in the ocean. They missed entirely the one piece of data that the Allied meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, had spotted, a small, temporary bubble of high pressure that would create a brief calm window on June 6th. Based on the information available to them, the German conclusion was logical and fatal. The technical parameters for an amphibious landing were rigid. The Allies needed manageable surf for the landing craft, clear skies for the bombers to neutralize coastal defenses, and low tides to expose the beach obstacles. The report confirmed that none of these conditions would exist. The sea was too rough for the flat-bottom boats, and the cloud cover would ground the Allied air support. Crucially, the report dovetailed with the immutable laws of the tides. The Germans knew that the Allies required a dawn high tide to land their first wave. The window for these specific tidal conditions was narrow, existing only from June 5th to June 7th. With the meteorologists guaranteeing storms through June 8th, the conclusion was mathematical. The invasion window had snapped shut. The convergence of bad weather and the tidal cycle meant that the Allies had missed their chance for early June. The impact of this assessment on the high command was immediate. The rigid posture of immediate alarm was relaxed. If the Allies could not land now, they would be forced to wait for the next suitable tidal cycle, which wouldn't arrive until the second half of June. This bought the German defenses at least 2 weeks of guaranteed safety. The mental calculus shifted from urgent defense to administrative maintenance. The crisis was postponed. This false certainty rippled outwards to the other commanders. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army in Normandy, decided to schedule a map exercise, a Kriegspiel, in the city of Rennes for June 6th. He ordered his divisional commanders and corps commanders to leave their coastal posts and travel inland to attend the wargame. The topic of the exercise was, ironically, how to handle an Allied paratroop landing. They felt safe enough to simulate a battle on a map because the weathermen had assured them a real battle was impossible outside. At La Rocheguyon, the tension that had sustained Rommel for months finally broke. He was a man who respected the laws of nature as much as the laws of war. He looked at the charts, listened to the howling wind, and accepted the reprieve. The Desert Fox was not prone to gambling with the safety of his troops, but this wasn't a gamble in his eyes. It was a certainty backed by science. The Atlantic Wall could be left on autopilot for a few days. With the threat of invasion removed from the immediate timeline, Rommel's thoughts turned to the personal matters he had been neglecting. He had been away from Germany for months, driving himself into a state of chronic fatigue. The quiet period predicted by Major Leto offered a rare opportunity to recharge. He could drive home, meet with Hitler to once again beg for the panzers, and perhaps most importantly, attend a family celebration that coincided perfectly with this unexpected lull. The meteorologist's report was the final key that unlocked the door to disaster. It transformed the storm from a tactical nuisance into a strategic alibi. It assured the most capable defender in Europe that he could turn his back on the sea, just for a moment, without consequence. As the briefing ended and the officers returned to their duties, the sound of the rain against the glass was no longer ominous. It was the sound of a holiday. Following the meteorologist's assurance that the storm was impenetrable, a palpable shift occurred across the entire Western Front. The immediate alert status, which had kept the coastal divisions on a razor's edge for weeks, was quietly downgraded. The collective psychology of the Wehrmacht transitioned from a posture of imminent combat to one of garrison maintenance. It was a psychological demobilization. The belief that the invasion was impossible for at least 2 weeks acted like a sedative on the German command structure. The frantic energy that Rommel had instilled during the spring evaporated, replaced by the mundane routines of occupation. This relaxation was most visible in the behavior of the senior leadership. With the threat of a landing removed from the table, the officers felt safe to leave their posts for administrative duties or personal leave. General Friedrich Dahlmann, the commander of the 7th Army, the very army responsible for defending Normandy, confirmed his plans to proceed with the map exercise in Rennes. He issued orders for his corps and divisional commanders to join him there on June 6th. The irony was stark. To simulate a theoretical battle on a map, they were abandoning the actual battlefield, leaving their units leaderless at the exact moment the enemy was approaching. The exodus of command extended beyond the infantry. General Edgar Feuchtinger, the commander of the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to the coast to intervene immediately, decided to travel to Paris. His motivations were personal. Historical accounts suggest he went to visit his girlfriend and acquire black market supplies, confident that his tanks would not be needed in the mud and rain of Normandy. His departure meant that even if an alarm were raised, the critical order to mobilize the tanks would have to find him in a nightclub or a hotel room in the capital, hours away from his headquarters. On the sea, the vigilance of the Kriegsmarine dissolved completely. Admiral Crank, satisfied that the gale was doing his job for him, suspended all offensive patrols. The E-boats, fast attack craft that could have potentially spotted the approaching armada or laid fresh mines in the invasion lanes, remained moored in the harbors of Cherbourg and Le Havre. The German Navy effectively ceded control of the channel to the storm. The crews were granted shore leave, drinking in the local French bistros, secure in the knowledge that no ship in the world would dare leave port in such weather. In the concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, the common soldiers also lowered their guard. The grueling schedule of laying mines and erecting obstacles was halted by the torrential rain. Men who had been digging trenches for months were finally allowed to retreat indoors. They huddled around coal stoves in their dugouts, drying their uniforms and playing cards. The sentries remained at their posts, peering through the slits of the pillboxes, but they were looking at a wall of gray rain that obscured the horizon. The visibility was so poor that binoculars were useless, and the deafening wind masked any sound of engines from the sea or sky. The Luftwaffe's paralysis further deepened the blindness of the German defense. With the reconnaissance planes grounded, the Third Reich had no eyes beyond the coastline. Usually, a massive buildup of shipping would be detected days in advance by aerial patrols, but the skies over the channel were empty. The German radar operators along the coast of Calvados were struggling with clutter caused by the high waves and atmospheric interference. When blips did appear, they were dismissed as ghost signals or flocks of birds, interpreted through the lens of the prevailing belief that nothing was out there. This lull created a dangerous vacuum of authority. The intricate chain of command that Rommel had tried to streamline was now fragmented by distance and complacency. If an attack were to occur, the decision-making loop would be broken. The artillery commanders were in Rennes, the tank commander was in Paris, and the naval patrols were in port. The defense of Fortress Europe was running on autopilot, relying entirely on the assumption that the enemy followed the same logic as the defenders. The Germans were victims of their own rationality. They believed that General Eisenhower was a prudent, calculated commander who would never risk his fleet in a Force 5 gale. They projected their own operational constraints onto the Allies, assuming that because they would not attack in this weather, the Americans and British would not either. They failed to account for the desperation of the Allied timetable or the technological advancements that allowed the invasion fleet to navigate in rougher seas than the Germans thought possible. Inside the headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, the staff began to catch up on the backlog of paperwork. The frantic ringing of telephones slowed down. The officers enjoyed a rare, leisurely dinner on the night of June 4th, discussing politics and the Eastern Front rather than the tides. The storm was viewed as a faithful ally, a weather wall that had bought them time to breathe. There was no sense of impending doom, only the comfort of the rain drumming against the roof. It was in this atmosphere of suspended animation that Erwin Rommel made his final decision. The front was quiet, the enemy was pinned down by the weather, and his subordinates were dispersing to their various tasks. The Desert Fox saw no reason to remain trapped in a castle while the war was on hold. The lull provided the perfect window for a quick trip to Germany, a journey that combined duty with a personal milestone that he had been looking forward to for weeks. With the meteorologists' report securely in hand and the coastal front seemingly frozen by the gale, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel made the fateful decision to step away from his command. It was not a choice made out of negligence, but rather a calculation born of the lull. For months, he had been a prisoner of his own headquarters, shackled to the maps and the telephone at La Roche-Guyon. The stress had taken a physical toll on him. He suffered from rheumatism and chronic headaches, and the relentless pressure of the Atlantic Wall construction had drained his reserves. The storm provided the first legitimate pause in the timeline, a brief interlude where his physical presence at the front seemed unnecessary. Rommel called for his aide, Captain Helmuth Lang, and ordered the preparation of his open-topped Horch staff car. The plan was to depart early on the morning of June 5th. It was a long, arduous drive from northern France to his home in Herlingen, near the city of Ulm in Germany. The journey would take the better part of a day, traversing the French countryside and crossing the border into the Reich. In a world before mobile communications, this meant that the commander of Army Group B would be effectively incommunicado for several critical hours, isolated in a moving vehicle on the Autobahn. The primary justification for the trip was official and strategic. Rommel intended to continue past his home to the Obersalzberg in Berchtesgaden to meet with Adolf Hitler. The dispute over the Panzer reserves, which had plagued his command for months, was still unresolved. Rommel believed that the written reports sent by his chief of staff, General Speidel, were being ignored or filtered by the high command before they reached the Führer. He was convinced that only a personal appeal man-to-man could persuade Hitler to release the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzerlehr Division to his direct control. He needed to look Hitler in the eye and demand the tools to save the Western Front. However, beneath the veneer of official business, there was a deeply personal motivation pulling Rommel toward Germany. June 6th was not just another day on the calendar. It was the 50th birthday of his wife, Lucy. Rommel was a devoted husband, and his relationship with Lucy was the emotional anchor of his life. Throughout the war, he had written to her almost daily, sharing his fears and frustrations. Missing such a significant milestone was something he desperately wanted to avoid, and the weather gods seemed to have granted him a pass to be there. In the privacy of his quarters, Rommel packed a special item he had procured in Paris, a pair of elegant gray suede shoes. He knew Lucy had a fondness for fashion, and in the austerity of wartime Germany, such luxury items were rare treasures. He pictured the scene of presenting them to her, a quiet moment of domestic normalcy far removed from the mines and bunkers of Normandy. This gift symbolized where his mind was drifting, away from the zone of death and toward the comfort of his Swabian home. Before finalizing the plan, Rommel consulted once more with General Hans Speidel. The two men reviewed the situation map. The enemy was invisible, the sea was chaotic, and the subordinate commanders were already dispersing to their own distractions. Speidel, a capable intellectual and a calming influence, agreed that the risk was negligible. He assured the field marshal that he could handle the routine signals traffic at La Roche-Guyon. Go, Herr Feldmarschall. The consensus seemed to be, nothing will happen in this weather. Rommel set a strict itinerary. He planned to spend the 6th of June celebrating with Lucy in Herlingen. On the 7th, he would drive south to Berchtesgaden to confront Hitler. If all went according to plan, he would be back at his headquarters in France by the evening of the 8th or the morning of the 9th, just as the storm front was predicted to pass. It was a tight schedule, but one that fit perfectly within the window of safety promised by the meteorologists. The staff at headquarters began the logistical preparations for the journey. Security details were arranged, and the route was mapped out to avoid areas where Allied fighter bombers were known to hunt German staff cars. The fuel tanks were filled, and the driver was briefed. There was a sense of relief among the immediate staff. When the old man was away, the frantic pace of the headquarters usually slowed down, allowing everyone a chance to breathe. As the evening of June 4th turned into the pre-dawn hours of June 5th, Rommel slept soundly, believing he had outsmarted the calendar. He was confident that the Allies were paralyzed by the same storm that rattled his windows. He did not know that across the channel, amidst the same howling wind, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was sitting in a trailer in Southwick House, agonizing over a decision that would make Rommel's travel plans the most tragic scheduling error of the war. At 7 o'clock on June 5th, the engine of the Horch roared to life. Rommel stepped into the car, his baton in hand, his mind already projecting forward to the birthday dinner in Hurlingen. As the car crunched over the gravel of the castle driveway and turned east toward Germany, the commander of the Atlantic Wall turned his back on the coast. He was leaving the battlefield at the precise moment the largest armada in history was starting its engines. As the Black Horch staff car sped eastward through the French countryside, putting miles between the field marshal and the coast, Rommel's mind was occupied by far more than his wife's birthday. While the gray suede shoes in his luggage were a gesture of love for Lucy, the briefcase sitting on the seat next to him contained the potential salvation of the Third Reich. The trip to Hurlingen was merely a convenient stopover. The true destination was the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps. Rommel was driving to Germany to stage a personal intervention with Adolf Hitler, a desperate political maneuver to fix the broken chain of command before the invasion began. The compromise command structure that Hitler had instituted earlier in the spring, splitting the armored reserves between Rommel and the High Command, OKW, gnawed at the field marshal. As the car navigated the potholed roads, Rommel replayed the arguments he intended to present to the Führer. He was convinced that the current setup was a recipe for disaster. The elite Panzerlehr Division and the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend were currently parked too far inland, effectively paralyzed by bureaucracy. Rommel's goal for this trip was absolute and specific. He would demand total operational control over these two units. He had already selected the exact terrain where he wanted to deploy them. Rommel planned to move the 12th SS immediately into the area between the Orne River and the Corentin Estuary. He reasoned that this sector, near the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, was the most likely seam where the Allies would try to drive a wedge between the German armies. If the tanks were dug in there before the first paratrooper landed, they could massacre the invasion force in the assembly areas. But to move them, he needed a signature that only one man could provide. Rommel knew he was walking into a snake pit. The High Command in Berlin, particularly Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, viewed Rommel with jealousy and suspicion. They considered him a people's general, an upstart who lacked the proper general staff pedigree. They had been whispering in Hitler's ear, arguing that Rommel was too pessimistic, too focused on the beach, and too willing to retreat. Rommel knew that sending telegrams or reports through the standard channels was useless. Jodl would simply filter them out or delay them until they were irrelevant. His only trump card was his personal relationship with Hitler. For years, Rommel had been the Führer's favorite soldier, the poster boy of National Socialism's military prowess. He believed that if he could bypass the layer of sycophants at OKW and speak to Hitler face-to-face, he could rekindle that old trust. He rehearsed his lines, preparing to use the full force of his personality to explain that the Atlantic Wall was brittle without the armored backbone to support it. He was prepared to stake his entire reputation on this request. The timing of the trip was a calculated strategic gamble. Rommel estimated that the storm over the channel gave him a safety window of 3 to 4 days. His itinerary was tight. Spend June 6th with Lucy, drive to Berchtesgaden on the 7th, meet Hitler, secure the release of the Panzer divisions, and race back to France by the 8th or 9th. In his mind, he would return to La Rocheguyon just as the weather cleared, bringing with him the authority to finally position the pieces on the board exactly as he wanted them. As the car crossed the border into Germany, the landscape shifted from occupied territory to the homeland. The sight of unscathed German villages in the south and the orderly fields reinforced his resolve. He was fighting to keep the war away from these borders. He truly believed that the invasion of France was the final barrier. If he failed to stop the Allies on the beach, he knew the war would eventually roll over the very roads he was driving on. The stakes of the meeting at the Berghof were existential. Unbeknownst to Rommel, the political ground had already shifted beneath him. While he was en route, the signals intelligence war was turning against him. The Allies were maintaining total radio silence regarding the actual invasion, while maintaining the loud deception of the Ghost Army in Kent. Hitler, influenced by Jodl, was becoming more convinced by the day that the main attack would come at Calais, not Normandy. Rommel was traveling to argue for reinforcements in Normandy at the exact moment the Führer's intuition was drifting further east. By the late afternoon of June 5th, the staff car pulled into the driveway of his home in Hurlingen. The domestic tranquility of the house stood in stark contrast to the grim fortifications he had left behind. He was greeted by Lucy and his son, Manfred. For a few hours, the Desert Fox was just a husband and father. He presented the gray suede shoes, and the mood was celebratory. The war seemed distant, held at bay by the storm and the comforting illusion of time. That night, Rommel went to bed in his own home, exhausted from a long drive, but mentally prepared for the battle ahead, not against the Americans, but against the German High Command. He closed his eyes on the eve of June 6th, believing that the decisive moment of the war was still days away, waiting for his meeting with Hitler. He slept soundly, unaware that while he was dreaming of political maneuvers, the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne were already boarding their planes, ready to drop into the very gaps he had hoped to plug. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the sun rose over the Swabian hills of Hurlingen, casting a peaceful light on the Rommel family villa. It was a Tuesday, a day that promised to be marked by quiet celebration rather than the roar of artillery. For Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, waking up in his own bed was a luxury he had scarcely known in recent years. The silence of the house stood in stark contrast to the cacophony of the Atlantic Wall construction sites. Here, the air smelled of coffee and fresh bread, not the salt spray and wet concrete of the French coast. This specific date held a profound significance for the Rommel household. It was Lucy Rommel's 50th birthday. Lucy was more than just a wife. She was the Field Marshal's anchor, the one person with whom he shared his deepest anxieties about the war and the regime. In the private world of the Desert Fox, Lucy was the center of gravity. Rommel had gone to great lengths to ensure he was present for this milestone, viewing it as a necessary act of devotion to balance the months of absence required by his duty. The morning began with a sense of domestic normalcy that bordered on the surreal. The family gathered for a birthday breakfast, a scene that could have belonged to any upper-middle-class German family, if not for the uniform hanging in the hallway. Rommel, usually tense and preoccupied with maps, was visibly relaxed. He presented Lucy with a gift that had motivated the specific timing of his journey, the pair of gray suede shoes he had carefully procured in Paris. In the resource-starved economy of 1944 Germany, such an item was a rare treasure, a symbol of elegance amidst the drab utility of total war. Lucy was delighted with the shoes, trying them on and walking through the parlor. For a brief hour, the conversation drifted away from the Eastern Front and the invasion threats. They discussed garden plans and family matters, indulging in the illusion that the war was a distant thunderstorm rumbling far away. Rommel mentioned his itinerary for the next day, confirming his plan to drive to Berchtesgaden to see Hitler, confident that the weather in the Channel was still holding the Allies at bay. Also present was their son, Manfred, a bright teenager serving as a Luftwaffenhelfer, anti-aircraft auxiliary. Manfred idolized his father, but was intelligent enough to sense the underlying tension that never fully left the field marshal. Yet, on this morning, even Manfred saw his father let his guard down. The family took a stroll in the garden, admiring the blooming flowers. It was a tableau of peace, a husband, a wife, and a son enjoying a spring morning, completely disconnected from the violence erupting hundreds of miles to the west. However, the irony of the moment was catastrophic. At the exact time Rommel was handing Lucy her birthday gift, American soldiers were drowning in the surf of Omaha Beach, and British commandos were fighting hand-to-hand in the streets of Ouistreham. The timeline of the family celebration was perfectly synchronized with the timeline of the German collapse. Every minute spent admiring the gray suede shoes was a minute lost in the command bunker. The Ghost Army deception and the weather report had successfully created two parallel realities. the bloody truth in Normandy, and the peaceful fiction in Hurlingen. The telephone in the villa, usually a source of constant interruption, remained strangely silent through the early morning. This silence was misinterpreted by Rommel as confirmation that the front was quiet. He assumed that if anything significant were happening, his chief of staff, General Speidel, would have called immediately. He did not know that the chaos in France was so absolute, and the German command so confused, that it took hours for the magnitude of the invasion to be understood and for the information to travel up the chain to finding him at his private residence. Around 10:15 a.m., the illusion was shattered. The phone finally rang, its shrill tone cutting through the birthday atmosphere. Rommel moved to answer it, perhaps expecting a routine update or a birthday well-wish from a colleague. Instead, he heard the strained voice of General Speidel on the line from La Roche-Guyon. The report was brief, panicked, and undeniable. Herr Feldmarschall, the invasion has begun. Enemy landings in force at the mouth of the Orne. Airborne drops in the Cotentin. It is not a drill. The color drained from Rommel's face. In an instant, the gray suede shoes, the birthday cake, and the garden walk were rendered trivial. The weatherproof window had been a mirage. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The enemy had come in the worst weather imaginable, and he, the commander of Army Group B, the man charged with defending Europe, was sitting in his living room in southern Germany, wearing civilian clothes. The birthday celebration ended not with a toast, but with a scramble for maps and the shouting of orders. Rommel slammed the receiver down, his mind racing to calculate the drive time back to France. It was the worst moment of his professional life. He turned to Lucy, the joy of the morning replaced by a grim mask of duty. "I must go," he told her. The holiday was over. The mistake was made. The Atlantic Wall was breached, and the Desert Fox was on the wrong side of the Rhine. With Field Marshal Rommel safely arrived in Germany, and the sun setting on June 5, 1944, a surreal calm descended upon the headquarters of Army Group B. The Duc de la Rochefoucauld's castle, usually a hive of nervous energy under the Desert Fox's watchful eye, settled into a relaxed rhythm. In Rommel's absence, command fell to his chief of staff, General Hans Speidel. Speidel was a stark contrast to his commander. He was a philosopher soldier, a man of high culture who preferred intellectual debate to inspecting tank traps. The fierce urgency that had defined the spring months evaporated, replaced by the quiet hum of a staff that believed the danger had passed with the storm. As the gale continued to lash against the castle walls, the officers inside felt secure in their isolation. The dinner service that evening was not the hurried meal of a combat unit on high alert, but rather a civilized gathering of gentlemen. Among the guests was Captain Ernst Junger, a renowned author and decorated veteran of the First World War. The conversation at the dinner table did not revolve around the potential landing zones or minefield densities. Instead, Speidel and Junger discussed literature, the state of the French peace movement, and the philosophical implications of the war. They drank wine and smoked, insulated from the reality that was churning in the dark waters of the Channel. While the glasses clinked at La Roche-Guyon, a critical intelligence failure was unfolding in the signals room. The German intelligence service had long known that the BBC broadcast coded messages to the French resistance, personal messages that sounded like nonsense but carried specific instructions. One specific set of lines from a poem by Paul Verlaine was known to be the signal for the imminent invasion. The first line, "The long sobs of the violins of autumn," had already been intercepted days prior. The Germans were waiting for the second line, "Wound my heart with a monotonous languor," which would signal that the invasion would begin within 48 hours. At 9:15 p.m. on the night of June 5th, the German listening posts intercepted that second fatal line. The message was clear. The French resistance was being mobilized to blow up rail lines and cut telephone wires. The invasion was imminent. The intelligence officer at the 15th Army headquarters, bordering the Pas-de-Calais, correctly identified the signal and immediately put his sector on full alert. He notified his superiors, expecting the alarm to ripple down the entire Western Front. However, when the information reached Army Group B at La Roche-Guyon, The reaction was perplexingly mute. The staff, lulled by the weather report and the absence of their decisive commander, hesitated. The prevailing logic in the castle was skepticism. Why, they reasoned. Would the Allies announce a surprise invasion over the public radio? It seemed too obvious, likely a deception or a drill to test German reactions. Speidel, operating without Rommel's instinctual paranoia, decided not to issue a general alert to the 7th Army in Normandy. This decision created a disjointed defense. In the Pas-de-Calais, soldiers rushed to their battle stations, weapons ready. But in Normandy, the sector where the ships were actually heading, the troops remained in their barracks. The warning from the BBC, which should have triggered sirens from Cherbourg to Caen, died in the bureaucratic air of the headquarters. The 7th Army was left sleeping, believing the night would be as uneventful as the last. Compounding the silence was the emptiness of the officer corps. It wasn't just Rommel who was missing. The commander of the 7th Army, General Dahlmann, was still preparing for his war games in Rennes. The subordinate commanders were scattered. The castle of La Roche-Guyon, which was supposed to be the brain of the Western defense, had essentially lobotomized itself. There was no one with the authority or the intuition to look at the combination of the weather, the radio intercepts, and the radar clutter, and scream, "Wake up!" As midnight approached, the storm outside began to mask the sound of engines overhead. The first waves of Allied transport planes, carrying thousands of paratroopers, were crossing the coast. Yet, inside the castle, the lights were being extinguished. The dinner guests retired to their rooms. The sentries walked their perimeter, shivering in the rain, unaware that the sky above them was filling with enemies. The vacuum left by Rommel was now absolute. Had he been there, pacing the floor, perhaps he would have sensed the change in the air. Perhaps he would have demanded the 21st Panzer Division stand to, just in case. But he was hundreds of miles away, sleeping in Hurlingen. The decision to leave, combined with the staff's intellectual arrogance, meant that the Atlantic Wall was effectively leaderless. The clock ticked past midnight, ushering in June 6th. The castle was silent. The phones were on the hook. The maps on the wall showed a static front. And in the darkness of a Normandy countryside, the first American paratrooper hit the wet French soil, unchallenged and unnoticed by the command center that was built to stop him. While the German high command was settling into a comfortable complacency, a diametrically opposite atmosphere gripped the Allied headquarters at Southwick House in Hampshire. Here, in the damp woods of southern England, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a pressure that no single man had arguably ever endured in history. Outside the library of the Georgian Manor, the same gale that had lulled Rommel into a false sense of security was rattling the sash windows with violent intensity. Rain lashed against the glass, a physical manifestation of the chaos threatening to derail the largest amphibious operation the world had ever seen. The situation on the morning of June 5th was desperate. The invasion force, over 150,000 men, 7,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft, was a coiled spring that could not be held under tension indefinitely. The troops were already loaded onto the transport ships, bobbing violently in the rough seas of the Solent, seasick and anxious. Eisenhower had already delayed the invasion by 24 hours due to the weather, a postponement that had strained the logistical chain to its breaking point. A further delay would require the fleet to return to port for refueling, a move that would almost certainly expose the secret to German reconnaissance and push the invasion back to mid-June or even July. At 4:15 a.m. on Monday, June 5th, Eisenhower gathered his top commanders in the library for the final decision conference. The room was thick with stale coffee smoke and nervous energy. Present were the giants of the Allied war machine: Bernard Montgomery for the ground forces, Bertram Ramsay for the Navy, and Trafford Leigh-Mallory for the Air Forces. They sat on mismatched furniture, listening to the wind howl down the chimney, waiting for the one man who held the key to the future: Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist. Stagg, a tall, serious Scot, walked into the room carrying the weight of the war on his clipboard. Unlike his German counterparts, who saw only the storm, Stagg had access to weather reports from ships in the mid-Atlantic. He presented a startlingly precise, yet fragile, prediction. He told the commanders that a previously unidentified cold front was moving faster than expected. Behind it, he forecasted a brief, temporary break in the weather, a bubble of relatively calm conditions that would last barely 24 hours starting on the morning of June 6th. It was a terrifyingly narrow window. The sea would still be rough, and the cloud cover would be patchy, making precision bombing difficult. But it was a window nonetheless. Stagg finished his report and stepped back. The silence that followed was heavy. The choice was binary. Launch now into marginal conditions and risk a disaster on the beaches, or postpone again and risk the security of the entire operation. The debate among the commanders was sharp. Air Marshal Lee Mallory was pessimistic, arguing that the cloud cover would prevent his bombers from neutralizing the coastal defenses, leaving the infantry exposed. He feared a slaughter. Admiral Ramsey, however, was cautiously optimistic. He believed the Navy could land the troops, though it would be messy. General Montgomery, with characteristic decisiveness, cut through the hesitation. "I would say go," he stated flatly. He believed the troops were at their peak and that waiting would destroy morale. Eisenhower listened to them all, pacing the floor, his face etched with exhaustion. He knew that ultimately the committee could not decide. The responsibility was his alone. If the invasion failed, if the men were massacred on the sands of Normandy, the blame would rest entirely on his shoulders. He visualized the young soldiers he had visited the day before, imagining them drowning in the swells or being cut down by machine gun fire because he misjudged the sky. The room fell silent again, waiting for the supreme commander. Eisenhower sat on a sofa, staring past his subordinates, weighing the lives of thousands against the liberation of a continent. He knew that the German defenders were likely assuming a stand down, and that the element of surprise was the only advantage the weather offered. To go when the enemy expected them to stay was the ultimate gamble. After a long pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity, Eisenhower looked up. His voice was quiet but steady, devoid of any theatrical flair. "Okay," he said, "let's go." With those 3 simple words, the hesitation vanished. The machinery of war, paused for a day, roared back to life. Within minutes, the order flashed out from Southwick House to the waiting fleets. Halcyon, the code word for the operation to proceed, was transmitted to the signal lamps of the destroyers and the radio rooms of the airfields. The massive engines of the transport ships rumbled to life, churning the dark waters as they began to form their convoys. Eisenhower walked out of a library, the die cast. He had committed the free world to a singular course of action, launching an armada into a storm on the promise of a Scottish weatherman, while his opponent, Erwin Rommel, was miles away, driving unwittingly into the interior of Germany. Shortly before midnight on June 5, 1944, the silence of the Norman countryside was broken by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the cloud themselves. Inside the darkened farmhouses and damp bunkers of the Cotentin Peninsula, German sentries cocked their heads, listening to a sound that was distinct from the usual gale. It was not the high-pitched whine of fighter planes or the rhythmic thrum of heavy bombers passing through to target cities in the Reich. This was a deep, synchronized roar of thousands of engines, a mechanical swarm approaching from the north. The Luftwaffe had grounded its planes due to the storm, so every soldier on the ground knew instantly. These were not friendly aircraft. Above the cloud layer, an armada of over 800 Douglas C-47 transport planes was struggling to keep formation in the turbulent air. Inside the fuselage of each plane, heavily burdened American and British paratroopers sat in the dark, hooked up to their static lines. They were the vanguard of Eisenhower's gamble, the tip of the spear aimed at the flanks of the invasion zone. As the pilots navigated through the thick fog banks, the order to stand up was shouted over the roar of the wind. With green lights flashing in the cabins, thousands of men stepped into the void, plummeting toward a hostile landscape they had only seen in grainy reconnaissance photos. The drop did not go according to plan. The same storm that had convinced Rommel to go home played havoc with the Allied flight paths. Heavy cloud cover blinded the pilots, and intense German anti-aircraft fire forced them to break formation and take evasive action. As a result, the tight, cohesive drop zones marked on the maps disintegrated instantly. Paratroopers were scattered over hundreds of square miles, landing in churchyards, back gardens, and town squares far from their objectives. The precision surgical strike Rommel had feared became a chaotic shotgun blast of confusion. On the ground, Rommel's defensive preparations, specifically the flooding of the lowlands, began to take a grim toll. The field marshal had ordered the locks opened on the Douve and Murderet rivers to create impassable swamps, intended to drown the invasion before it could walk. In the darkness, heavily laden paratroopers, weighed down by 80 pounds of gear, dropped into these artificial lakes. Many drowned without ever firing a shot, dragged to the bottom by the very equipment meant to help them fight. It was a tragic validation of Rommel's foresight. His trap was working, even in his absence. However, the Rommel's asparagus, the wooden stakes planted in the open fields, had a mixed effect. While they tore the wings off several gliders that arrived in the second wave, killing many occupants, the sheer scattering of the paratroopers inadvertently worked in the Allies' favor. Because the Americans and British were dropping everywhere, the German defenders could not pinpoint the main effort. Reports flooded into local command posts of enemy troops in Corentin, in Saint-Mire-Église, and near Caen simultaneously. The Germans were fighting shadows, unable to distinguish between a major offensive and a diversionary raid. Down in the hedgerows, the war became personal and primitive. The scattered paratroopers used metal crickets, clickers that made a sharp snapping sound, to identify each other in the dark. One click required 2 clicks in response. Terrified and lost, men from different companies and divisions banded together in ad hoc squads. They cut telephone wires, ambushed German patrols, and blew up bridges. This lack of a coherent front line terrified the German garrison troops, who felt surrounded in every direction, amplifying the psychological shock of the night. The local German response was sluggish and disjointed. At the platoon and company level, junior officers tried to rally their men, but they were paralyzed by a lack of information from above. The command paralysis at La Roche-Guyon filtered down to the bunkers. Without a general alert, many German commanders assumed these were isolated commando raids or the crews of downed bombers. They hesitated to wake their superiors or commit their local reserves, wasting precious hours debating the nature of the threat while the Allied foothold grew stronger. In the British sector to the east, the vertical assault achieved a stunning success that would have horrified Rommel. Glider troops, executing a daring dead stick landing in pitch darkness, captured the vital bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal, later known as Pegasus Bridge, intact. This was the exact nightmare scenario Rommel had predicted. The enemy seizing the choke points behind the Atlantic Wall, effectively cutting off the coastal defenders from help. The speed and silence of the operation meant the bridges were in Allied hands before the German garrison fully woke up. By 2 o'clock on June 6th, the integrity of the Fortress Europe was shattered. The Atlantic Wall, designed to repel an attack from the sea, was now being eroded from behind. Thousands of Allied soldiers were roaming the French countryside, disrupting communications and sowing chaos. The hard shell of the coast remained intact, but the soft underbelly was being ripped open. The German defensive plan relied on a coordinated counterattack, but with the telephone lines cut and the commanders confused, coordination was impossible. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, the true scale of the disaster was still unknown to the German high command. They believed they were dealing with a localized nuisance. They did not realize that the chaotic, scattered drop was merely the prelude. While the paratroopers fought in the hedgerows out at sea, the battleships were rotating their turrets, and the landing craft were lowering their ramps. The invasion had begun, and the man who had built the defenses was still sleeping soundly in Hurlingen, unaware that his asparagus and floodwaters were the only things fighting back. As the church bells in Normandy tolled 2 o'clock on June 6th, the command bunkers of the Third Reich began to wake up, not with a coordinated roar, but with a stuttering confusion. The reports filtering in from the coast were frantic and contradictory, painting a picture of a battlefield that made no sense. Field telephone lines, many already cut by the French resistance or paratroopers, went dead mid-sentence. Where connections remained, panic-stricken lieutenants reported enemy soldiers dropping from the sky in sectors miles apart, from the marshes of Corentin to the woods east of the Orne. The map boards at the various headquarters lit up with red pins, but the pattern was chaotic, resembling a splatter of paint rather than a coherent military offensive. At the headquarters of the 84th Corps in St. Lo, General Eric Marks, a battle-hardened veteran with a wooden leg and a glass eye, was one of the few commanders immediately alert. Ironically, it was also his birthday, mirroring the situation with Lucy Rommel. Marks, however, was at his post, as reports of straw men exploding on impact reached him, referring to the Rupert decoys dropping with the real paratroopers. He tried to discern the truth. While the decoys were meant to confuse, Marks sensed the weight of the moment. He was responsible for the defense of the Normandy coast, and his intuition screamed that this was the invasion. Yet, he was a subordinate commander. He could not move the strategic reserves without permission from above. Higher up the chain, at Army Group B in La Roche-Guyon, the atmosphere was paralyzed by skepticism. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, sat at the center of the web, receiving calls from the 7th Army. The reports were baffling. Mere handfuls of paratroopers were being spotted, and in some areas, only empty parachutes or exploding dummies were found. Without Rommel's decisive instinct in the room, Speidel fell back on cautious logic. The prevailing wisdom of the High Command was that the Allies would launch a massive, concentrated assault on a major port, likely Calais. The scattered, messy nature of the reports from Normandy looked less like an invasion and more like a diversionary raid intended to draw German forces away from the real target. The ghost of Operation Fortitude was now doing its most damage. Every German general had been conditioned to expect the 1st U.S. Army Group to strike the Pas-de-Calais. When looking at the map of Normandy, the staff officers saw only chaos, not a main effort. They asked themselves, why would Eisenhower land in the difficult hedgerow country? Why land in a storm? Why drop paratroopers in such a disorganized fashion? The cognitive dissonance was powerful. They interpreted the lack of a clear pattern not as the result of a storm-blown drop, but as proof that this was a feint. General Max Pemsel, the chief of staff of the 7th Army, was one of the first to sound a definitive alarm. By 2:30, he called Speidel and stated plainly, this is a large-scale operation. He requested the immediate release of the Panzer reserves. However, the bureaucracy of the divided command structure now tightened its grip. Speidel, acting as Rommel's deputy, hesitated to commit the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit within striking distance, without a clearer picture. He ordered the division to stand to, but not to move. The tanks remained with their engines cold, waiting for an order that was delayed by debate. The confusion traveled up the wire to Paris, to the headquarters of OB West, commanded by the elderly Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. Rundstedt was less easily confused than Speidel. He smelled danger. Although he still believed Calais was the ultimate target, he recognized that the Normandy drop was too large to be ignored. At 4 o'clock, he made a decisive move, ordering the 2 most powerful reserve units, the 12th SS Panzer and Panzerlehr, to prepare to move immediately toward the coast. It was the correct military decision, the one that could have thrown the paratroopers back into the sea. However, Rundstedt's authority had a fatal limit. These specific divisions were part of the OKW Reserve. Technically, they belonged to Adolf Hitler. Rundstedt could order them to prepare, but he could not order them to roll without the Führer's stamp of approval. The staff at OB West immediately telephoned the OKW headquarters in Berchtesgaden, hundreds of miles away in Germany, to ratify the movement order. They expected a quick confirmation, a rubber stamp given the urgency of the situation. Instead, they hit a wall of silence. At the Berghof, General Alfred Jodl and his staff were asleep. When the duty officer finally took the call, he refused to wake Jodl for what he considered unconfirmed reports. The strict standing order was that the reserves could only be released by Hitler, and Hitler took a sedative to sleep and was not to be disturbed before noon. The fear of the dictator was greater than the fear of the enemy. The duty officers at OKW argued that they needed to wait until morning to see if this was just a diversion. This refusal created a surreal operational pause. In Paris, Rundstedt was furious but powerless, his hands tied by the very regime he served. In La Roche-Guyon, Speidel waited for clarity that never came. In the bunkers of Normandy, the phone lines went dead. And in the tank parks of the Panzerlehr Division, the crews sat on their massive Tiger and Panther tanks, fully ammunitioned and ready to fight, listening to the distant rumble of bombing, yet forbidden to turn their tracks a single inch. As the night wore on, the fog of war thickened into a concrete barrier. The Germans were debating whether it was a raid or an invasion, failing to realize it was already a catastrophe. The critical hours, the time when the paratroopers were most vulnerable, disorganized, and without heavy weapons, were ticking away. The German war machine, built on speed and aggression, was paralyzed by a telephone line that no one dared to use. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, signaling the approach of dawn, the opportunity for a swift counterattack had been lost. The German commanders were still looking at their maps, waiting for the real invasion at Calais, waiting for Rommel to return, and waiting for Hitler to wake up. They did not look out to sea. If they had, the debate would have ended instantly. Through the mist, the shapes of 7,000 ships were beginning to materialize on the horizon, bringing with them the answer to every question the headquarters had failed to ask. While the coastline of Normandy erupted into a chaotic inferno of tracer fire and screaming mortar shells, a profound and tragic silence blanketed the villa in Hurlingen. 500 miles away from the bunkers he had designed, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel lay in a deep, undisturbed sleep. The man known to the world as the Desert Fox, famous for his hyper-alertness and his habit of leading from the front, was currently the most isolated commander in the German military. The storm that raged outside his window in southern Germany was merely a weather system, not the backdrop for the greatest amphibious assault in history. In the dark hours between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock on June 6th, while Rommel slept, the specific defensive networks he had spent months agonizing over were being systematically dismantled. At the Merville Battery, British paratroopers were engaging in desperate hand-to-hand combat to silence the guns. At the Pegasus Bridge, gliders had already crash-landed and seized the crossing. The intricate web of Rommel's asparagus and minefields, his pride and joy, was being breached by men who had dropped from the sky. The architect of the Atlantic Wall was unconscious, while his creation was being put to the ultimate test. The tragedy of this moment was compounded by the failure of the communication network he had fought to streamline. In a cruel twist of fate, the confusion at his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon acted as a buffer that protected his sleep. General Speidel and the staff, paralyzed by the debate over whether this was a raid or an invasion, chose not to disturb the field marshal. They reasoned that until the picture was clear, there was no point in waking him. This hesitation created a time capsule in Hurlingen, preserving a peace that no longer existed in reality. As the hands of the clock crept toward 5:30, the sun began to rise over the English Channel, revealing the terrified German defenders' worst nightmare. The gray mist dissolved to show an ocean paving over with steel. The naval bombardment began, a seismic event that shook the earth of Normandy. Battleships like the USS Texas and HMS Warspite unleashed broadsides that turned concrete casemates into dust. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of high explosives that shattered the eardrums of the men in the bunkers. Yet in the Swabian hills, the only sound was the wind in the trees and the rhythmic breathing of a man on leave. For the soldiers manning the MG-42s in the Widerstandsnest resistance nests on Omaha and Utah beaches, the absence of their leader was palpable, even if they didn't know the specifics. The mythology of Rommel was a powerful combat multiplier. The troops believed that he was watching, that he had a plan, and that the panzers were already on their way. They fought with the desperation of men who expected immediate reinforcement. They did not know that the panzers were parked and their commander-in-chief was currently wearing pajamas, miles removed from the nearest radio. Inside the villa, The domestic routine began to stir as dawn broke. The household staff prepared for the day, focused on the birthday celebration that was to continue. The contrast between the two worlds was absolute. In one world, American Rangers were scaling the cliffs of Point du Hoc with grappling hooks, dying on the wet rocks. In the other world, coffee was being brewed, and the biggest concern was the schedule for the drive to Berchtesgaden. The fog of war had effectively split Rommel's life into two parallel timelines that were about to collide violently. Rommel woke naturally, refreshed from the rest that he had so desperately needed. He was unaware that he had just slept through the most critical operational phase of the entire war. The golden hours, the time when a counterattack must be launched to throw an invader back into the sea, had passed. The paratroopers had linked up, the beaches were being stormed, and the confusion of the night was solidifying into a beachhead. The delay in waking him meant that any order he gave now would be reactionary, not preemptive. He shaved and dressed, putting on his uniform with the meticulous care of a Prussian officer. He looked out the window, perhaps checking the weather again, still convinced that the conditions ruled out an invasion. The confidence he had placed in the meteorologist's report remained unshaken. In his mind, the Atlantic Wall was standing vigil in the rain, secure and quiet. He prepared to go down to breakfast with Lucy, anticipating a pleasant morning before the political battles with Hitler. The psychological dislocation of this morning would haunt historians for decades. It was the ultimate example of the Clausewitzian friction of war. The one man who understood the necessity of stopping the Allies on the water's edge was the only man who wasn't there to direct it. The German defense was headless. The nervous system of the army group B had been severed at the neck, leaving the body to thrash about wildly while the brain remained engaged in domestic pleasantries. The clock struck 6 o'clock. In Normandy, the first wave of landing craft hit the sand. The ramps dropped and the slaughter began. In Hurlingen, the house was quiet. The phone sat on the table, a black plastic device that contained the end of the Third Reich. It was about to ring, and when it did, it would not bring birthday wishes. It would bring the news that Rommel was already too late, that the gamble of the leave had been lost, and that the longest day had started without him. While Rommel prepared for breakfast in Hurlingen, and the first wave of American infantry struggled through the surf at Omaha, a surreal and silent battle was being fought in the skies over the Pas-de-Calais. To the north of the actual invasion zone, the Royal Air Force was executing a masterclass in electronic illusion, designed to ensure that the German High Command remained fixated on the wrong stretch of coastline. This was the climax of the deception efforts, Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer. These missions required no bombs and no paratroopers, but they would prove as lethal as any panzer division by freezing the enemy's most powerful reserves in place. High above the dark, churning waters of the Strait of Dover, squadrons of Lancaster bombers from the elite 617 Dambusters Squadron and 218 Squadron were flying a flight path of agonizing precision. Their bomb bays were filled not with high explosives, but with millions of strips of aluminum-coated paper known as window or duppel to the Germans. The pilots and navigators were tasked with flying tight, repetitive orbits that gradually advanced toward the French coast. It was a tedious, nauseating task in the turbulence of a storm, but the mathematical perfection of their flight was essential to the ruse. The science behind the deception was ingenious. By dropping bundles of the metallic strips at calculated intervals, 12 bundles every minute, the bombers created a dense cloud of radar-reflective material. On the German radar screens at Cap d'Annefer and Boulogne, these clouds did not look like aircraft. Because the planes moved forward only gradually while circling, the returning radar echo coalesced into a single massive blip that appeared to be moving across the water at exactly 7 knots, the speed of a heavy invasion fleet. To the exhausted German radar operators staring into their glowing cathode ray tubes, the picture was terrifyingly clear. They saw an armada of ships, 14 miles wide and 16 miles deep, steaming directly toward the Pas-de-Calais. The electronic signature was indistinguishable from reality. It confirmed everything they had been told to expect. The storm was a cover, and the real invasion was finally launching against the narrowest point of the channel, just as Hitler had predicted. Beneath the bombers, the illusion was reinforced by the Royal Navy. A small flotilla of motor launches, too small to be picked up by radar themselves, towed barrage balloons fitted with radar reflectors. These boats carried massive jamming equipment known as moonshine, which amplified the German radar pulses and sent them back with the strength of a battleship. To add to the sensory overload, the crews played recordings of dropping anchors and shouting voices over powerful loudspeakers, broadcasting the sounds of a phantom army into the fog. The effect on the German command structure was immediate and paralyzing. Reports flashed from the radar stations to the headquarters of the 15th Army, the massive German force guarding the Pas-de-Calais. The 15th Army was the strategic sledgehammer Rommel had wanted in Normandy, but it was now standing to at full alert, facing an empty sea. General Hans von Salmuth, the army commander, believed he was about to face the main Allied assault. He ordered his divisions to hold their ground, refusing to release a single man or tank to the south. This electronic ghost effectively locked the gates of hell. While the 7th Army in Normandy was screaming for help, reporting heavy fighting and paratrooper drops, the High Command dismissed their pleas as a diversion. Normandy is the sideshow, the intelligence officers argued. The main blow is coming here at Calais. Look at the radar. The Phantom Fleet created a cognitive tunnel vision that blinded the generals to the bloody reality unfolding just 100 miles to the west. The deception bought the Allies the most precious commodity of the morning, time. For critical hours, while the beachheads were fragile and the troops were vulnerable, the German response remained split. The 15th Army sat in its bunkers, weapons trained on the horizon, waiting for an enemy that existed only as strips of paper falling through the clouds. Every minute they waited was a minute the Americans and British used to push inland, securing the foothold that would eventually doom the Third Reich. As dawn broke, the visual reality finally overtook the electronic nightmare. The German sentries on the cliffs of Calais peered through their binoculars, expecting to see thousands of landing craft and battleships emerging from the mist. Instead, they saw nothing but the gray, heaving swell of the empty ocean. The fleet had vanished. The phantom signals faded as the bombers turned for home, and the aluminum strips settled into the waves. The realization of the trickery dawned slowly, but the damage was already done. The sun was up, the strategic reserves had been held back, and the true invasion force in Normandy had established a grip on the continent that could not be broken. The Ghost Army had won the battle of the mind, leaving the German High Command chasing shadows while the war was being lost on the beaches of Calvados. As the clocks at the headquarters of Army Group B ticked past 6 o'clock on June 6th, the fog of uncertainty that had plagued General Hans Speidel throughout the night began to lift, replaced by a terrifying clarity. For hours, the staff at La Roche-Guyon had debated the nature of the parachute drops, clinging to the hope that the chaotic reports indicated a diversionary raid. However, as dawn illuminated the Normandy coast, the debate was silenced by a sound that traveled inland from a sea, a low, rolling thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet. It was the distinct, rhythmic concussion of heavy naval artillery. The Allied fleet was not a phantom on a radar screen. It was physically hammering the Atlantic wall. Speidel, a man of intellect and composure, looked at the situation map and realized the magnitude of the error. The red pins marking enemy contact were no longer scattered in random. They were coalescing into solid blocks along 5 distinct beaches. The decoy theory evaporated. No army would commit battleships and thousands of men to a mere feint while the weather was still foul. The Chief of Staff understood that the gross sweaterage, the weather report that had promised them safety, had been wrong. The invasion was not weeks away. It was happening now, and the Commander-in-Chief was 500 miles away in Germany. The decision to call Rommel was heavy with implication. To wake the Field Marshal was to admit that the staff had misjudged the night. Speidel gathered the latest intelligence reports from the 7th Army, which were growing increasingly desperate. The 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach was reporting heavy assaults. The defenders at Utah were being overrun, and the British had breached the perimeter at Gold and Sword. With this grim dossier in hand, Speidel ordered the call to be placed to Hurlingen. The lines of communication, miraculously still intact despite the French resistance's sabotage, connected the panic of the front to the quiet of the Rommel villa. When the connection was established, the conversation was stripped of all pleasantries. Speidel did not waste time with apologies. He delivered the situation report with military precision. Herr Feldmarschall, the enemy has landed with heavy naval and air support on a broad front between the Orne and the Weser. It is a full-scale invasion. The words hung in the air, dismantling the entire strategic assumption of the previous week. The lull had been a trap. On the other end of the line, Rommel listened in silence, his mind racing to catch up with a reality that had shifted overnight. The shock was not just tactical, it was personal. He had left the front based on a calculation of probability that had failed. He asked the immediate, critical question, what is the status of the reserves? He needed to know if the 21st Panzer Division had been unleashed to crush the beachhead, while the enemy was still disorganized. Speidel's answer confirmed Rommel's worst fears. The 21st Panzer, the only hammer close enough to strike, was technically alerted, but had not yet been fully committed to a counterattack because of the confusing chain of command and the earlier uncertainty. Worse, the two powerful divisions that Rommel had planned to beg Hitler for, the 12th SS and Panzerlehr, were still locked under OKW authority, requiring Hitler's direct permission to move. The German reaction was frozen in bureaucratic amber, while the Allies were pouring concrete and steel onto the French soil. Rommel realized instantly that the battle for the beaches, the only battle he believed Germany could win, was being lost in these opening hours. The waterline strategy depended on immediate, automatic counterattacks. Every minute of delay allowed the Allies to bring more tanks and artillery ashore. "I am returning immediately," Rommel barked into the phone. He ordered Speidel to do everything possible to mobilize the 21st Panzer and to keep petitioning Rundstedt and Berlin for the strategic reserves. The call ended, severing the link between the headquarters and the commander. For Speidel, the receiver clicking back into its cradle marked the beginning of a frantic day of damage control. He had to manage a crumbling front line while his commander spent the next 10 hours in a car. The headquarters at La Roche-Guyon transformed from a place of gentlemanly debate into a frantic nerve center, trying to plug gaps in a dam that had already burst. For Rommel, the call was the death knell of his strategy. He stood in his home, the receiver down, looking at the gray suede shoes he had gifted Lucy only moments before. The domestic tranquility was now a suffocating reminder of his mistake. The weeks-away prediction was now a mockery. He had to leave his wife, his home, and his birthday plans behind, knowing that he was driving back to a catastrophe he had predicted but failed to prevent. The 6 o'clock call and the subsequent updates that morning was the pivot point of history for Army Group B. It marked the end of illusion. The Atlantic Wall had been breached not just by explosives, but by a failure of imagination and a fatal reliance on the weather. As Rommel shouted for his driver and grabbed his baton, he knew the race was on not to stop the invasion, but to salvage what was left of the Western Front before the sheer weight of American and British material crushed it completely. While Rommel frantically packed his bags in Hurlingen and the beaches of Normandy ran red with blood, the decision that would decide the fate of the invasion rested in a quiet bedroom in the Bavarian Alps. The Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat above Berchtesgaden, was wrapped in a serene alpine mist, utterly removed from the violence erupting in France. Here, the machinery of the Third Reich did not operate on military time, but on the eccentric biological clock of the Führer. Adolf Hitler, suffering from insomnia and a reliance on potent sedatives, had gone to bed at 4 a.m. after holding court with his inner circle, listening to Wagner and discussing dull, artistic trivialities while the invasion fleet was already approaching the coast. The tragedy for the German army was not just that their leader was asleep, but that he had constructed a system where no one else was allowed to be awake. The two most powerful armored divisions in France, the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzerlehr Division, were designated as OKW reserves. This meant they belonged personally to Hitler. Field Marshal von Rundstedt in Paris had ordered them to prepare for movement at dawn, sensing the gravity of the situation, but he could not physically send them into battle without a direct order from the Berghof. The most potent counterattack force in the West was paralyzed by a chain of command that ended at a closed door. Between 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock, the phone lines to the Berghof were hot with desperate pleas from the West. General Blumentritt, Rundstedt's chief of staff, called General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operations staff at OKW. Blumentritt explained that the landings were massive and that the coastal defenses were buckling. He demanded the immediate release of the tanks. Jodl, however, was a man consumed by caution and fear of his master. He was awake, but he refused to issue the order. "We must wait for clarity," Jodl argued. He was terrified of committing the strategic reserve to a diversionary attack, still haunted by the phantom army of Operation Fortitude. The atmosphere among the junior adjutants at the Berghof was one of terrified paralysis. They knew the invasion had started, but the strict standing order was that the Führer was never to be disturbed before noon. No one, not the naval liaison, not the army adjutants, not even Jodl, dared to knock on the bedroom door. They feared Hitler's wrath more than they feared the Allied beachhead. So, while American troops were struggling to secure the exits at Omaha Beach and British tanks were moving inland from Gold Beach, the German response was put on hold to protect the sleep of one man. As the morning dragged on, the golden window for a counterattack began to close. The Panzerlehr Division, an elite unit equipped with the best tanks in the world, sat idling in the forest south of Chartres. Its commander, General Fritz Behrlein, waited by his radio, watching the sky clear. He knew that every hour wasted was a death sentence. If he could move now, under the cover of the morning clouds, he could reach the coast by evening. If he had to wait until the sky cleared, the Allied Jabos, fighter bombers, would hunt his tanks down like rabbits on the open road. It was not until shortly after noon that Hitler finally emerged from his quarters, groggy and shuffling. When he was finally briefed on the situation by Jodl and Keitel, the reaction was not the decisive fury the generals expected. Instead, Hitler fell into a strange mood of euphoric arrogance. He did not view the invasion as a crisis, but as an opportunity. "The news couldn't be better," he declared to his sycophantic staff. "Now we have them where we can destroy them." He believed that by landing in France, the Allies had foolishly left the safety of England and walked into a trap. Despite this bravado, the release of the panzers was still not immediate. The briefing dragged on into a rambling conference about tactical details that Hitler could not possibly understand from a map room in Bavaria. It was late afternoon, around 1600 hours, before the definitive order was finally transmitted to OB West. The 12th SS and Panzerlehr were released for combat. The delay had lasted over 12 hours. The German army had lost an entire operational day because of a sleep schedule. The consequences of this delay were immediate and catastrophic. By the time General Behrlein received the order to move, the weather over northern France had improved. The Allied air forces, having flown thousands of sorties since dawn, owned the sky. As the Panzerlehr columns rolled out of the woods and onto the main roads, they were instantly spotted. Typhoons and thunderbolts descended on them, unleashing rockets and bombs. The division was mauled before it even reached the battlefield, losing tanks, fuel trucks, and precious time. Rundstedt, receiving the news in Paris, resigned himself to defeat. He knew that the moment to drive the Allies back into the sea had been the chaotic hours of the early morning, when the invaders were seasick and disorganized. That moment had been traded for a few extra hours of rest for the Führer. The Atlantic Wall had held the enemy for a few hours, but the command wall at Berchtesgaden had blocked the reinforcements for a day. In the end, the centralization of power, the very hallmark of the Nazi regime, proved to be its undoing. The thousands of men dying in the bunkers of Normandy were not betrayed by a lack of courage or ammunition, but by a bureaucracy that functioned only at the whim of a dictator. As Hitler sat down to a late vegetarian lunch, discussing the future architecture of Linz, the 21st Army Group was pouring ashore, securing the lodgment that would eventually lead them to the bunker where he slept. Shortly after the phone call with General Speidel ended, The Black Horch staff car sped out of the driveway of the villa in Hurlingen, kicking up gravel in its wake. It was roughly 10 a.m. on June 6th. The domestic idyll of the birthday morning had been shattered, replaced by a frantic urgency. Rommel sat in the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped his field marshal's baton, urging his driver, Daniel, to drive faster. Beside him, his aide, Captain Lang, sat in grim silence, holding the maps that measured the hundreds of miles separating the commander from his army. The irony was suffocating. The man who had built his reputation on speed and mobility was now trapped in a race he could not win, constrained by the physical limits of an internal combustion engine. The journey was a psychological torture session for Rommel. For months, he had preached a single, unyielding doctrine. The invasion must be defeated on the beaches within the first 24 hours. He had told his officers, the first 24 hours will be decisive. Now he was spending those exact hours sitting in a leather seat, staring at the passing German countryside, effectively removed from the war. Every mile that clicked by on the odometer represented a minute where his defenses were being dismantled without his direction. He was a spectator to his own defeat, isolated in a moving steel bubble while the battle of the century raged without him. As the car crossed the Rhine and entered France, the reality of the air war forced a change in tactics. In Germany, the roads were relatively safe, but in France, the sky belonged to the Allies. The Jabos, Allied fighter bombers, were prowling the road networks, strafing anything that moved. Rommel, the master of the offensive, was forced to adopt a defensive posture even in his transit. The car had to stick to secondary roads and tree-lined avenues to avoid detection, frequently slowing down or stopping to scan the horizon for the silhouette of a Typhoon or Mustang. This necessity of caution added agonizing delays to a schedule that was already broken. During the brief stops to refuel or telephone ahead, Rommel snatched fragments of information from local command posts. The news was a steady drip of disaster. He learned that the British had pushed inland from Gold and Sword beaches, and that American tanks were moving off Utah. With every report, Rommel's mental map of the battlefield darkened. He visualized the specific bunkers and batteries he had inspected, the 352nd Division at Omaha, the 21st Panzer near Cannes, and realized they were fighting in a vacuum of leadership. The coordination he had spent the spring perfecting was non-existent. It was now a series of isolated, desperate skirmishes. The drive also gave Rommel ample time for bitter self-recrimination. He cursed the meteorologists, the high command, and above all, his own judgment. The decision to leave for Lucy's birthday, which had seemed so rational under the cover of the storm report, now looked like criminal negligence. He knew that history would not judge him by his engineering feats on the Atlantic Wall, but by his absence on the one day the wall was needed. The Desert Fox had been outfoxed not by a brilliant tactical maneuver, but by a weather forecast and a desire to be a good husband. As the afternoon wore on, the staff car pushed deeper into the French interior, approaching the chaotic rear area of Army Group B. The roads were clogged not with reinforcements moving forward, but with confusion. Logistics trucks were burning by the roadside, victims of air attacks, and dispatch riders were weaving through the debris. Rommel saw firsthand the zone of death he had predicted, the total paralysis of German movement by Allied air power. He saw that even if the panzers were released, they would have to crawl through this gauntlet of fire to reach the front. The sun began to set, marking the end of the longest day. The critical daylight hours, the time when a German counterattack could have visually identified and targeted the landing craft, were gone. As darkness fell, the car was still miles from La Roche-Guyon. The 21st Panzer Division had finally attacked late in the afternoon, but without the support of the other divisions still held by Hitler. The attack had sizzled out. The Allied beachhead was no longer a fragile foothold. It was a solidified position, reinforced by men and material pouring in under the cover of dusk. It was nearly midnight when the Horch finally pulled into the courtyard of the Duc de la Rochefoucauld's castle. The drive had taken over 12 hours. Rommel stepped out of the car, stiff and exhausted. His uniform creased from the journey. He did not look like the energetic conqueror of Tobruk. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single day. The silence of the headquarters had been replaced by a frenetic, terrified buzz of activity. But the arrival of the commander felt less like a salvation and more like a formality. General Speidel met him at the entrance. The look exchanged between the two men spoke volumes. There was no need for a detailed briefing to understand the gravity of the situation. The maps on the wall told the story. The Atlantic Wall was broken. The Allies were ashore in force. The reserves had been held back too long. The gamble was lost. Rommel walked to the situation map, staring at the red lines that now carved deep pockets into the coast of France. He turned to his staff, his voice devoid of the optimism that had fueled the construction efforts of the spring. "It is now a battle of attrition," he muttered, realizing that the war of movement he excelled at was over. By arriving late on June 6th, Rommel effectively took command of a shipwreck. The desperate drive back to France had succeeded in returning the body of the field marshal to the front, but the spirit of the defense, the chance for victory, had been left behind on the road, lost somewhere between the birthday party in Hurlingen and the burning beaches of Normandy. By the dawn of June 7, 1944, the situation map at Army Group B headquarters told a story of irreversible catastrophe. Rommel, having finally returned to his post, stared at the acetate overlay with a grim realization that the operational window had slammed shut. The previous day, June 6th, had been the critical day of decision, where a counterattack might have pushed the fragile invasion force back into the sea. But that day was gone, lost to hesitation, travel time, and bureaucratic paralysis. What Rommel saw now was no longer a series of isolated landings, but a solidifying bridgehead. The Allies were not just ashore, they were digging in, linking up, and bringing the full weight of their industrial might onto French soil. The failure of the German response was epitomized by the fate of the 21st Panzer Division. During the chaos of D-Day, this lone armored unit had managed a desperate thrust toward the coast, reaching the sea near Luc-sur-Mer and momentarily splitting the British and Canadian sectors. It was the kind of aggressive maneuver Rommel would have exploited had he been present. However, without support from the withheld reserves and lacking a coordinated plan, the division was forced to withdraw to avoid being encircled. That single isolated counterattack was the high water mark of the German defense. By the time Rommel arrived, the 21st Panzer was exhausted, its tanks hull down in defensive positions, having failed to sever the Allied lifeline. Throughout the night of June 6th and into the morning of the 7th, while the German commanders were regrouping, the Allies had performed a logistical miracle. A steel bridge of ships stretched from Southampton to Normandy, immune to the Luftwaffe, which was nowhere to be seen. Tens of thousands of fresh troops, hundreds of Sherman tanks, and endless columns of supply trucks poured onto the beaches. The beachheads at Gold, Juno, and Sword had effectively merged, and the bloody struggle at Omaha had stabilized into a secure foothold. The chaos of the surf had been replaced by the order of a massive military harbor. Rommel immediately tried to organize a decisive counterstroke for June 7th, hoping to utilize the 12th SS Panzer and Panzerlehr divisions that Hitler had finally released. But the too little, too late reality became painfully clear as these units tried to reach the front. Having been held back during the overcast morning of June 6th, they were forced to approach the battlefield under the clear skies of June 7th. The Allied air forces, flying thousands of sorties, turned the approach roads into graveyards. The columns were hammered relentlessly, fuel trucks exploded, tanks were disabled, and the terrifying Hitlerjugend soldiers were bled white before they even saw an enemy infantryman. The strategic initiative had completely shifted. Rommel's entire defensive philosophy, the doctrine of the waterline, was predicated on denying the enemy a foothold. Now that the foothold was established, the war of movement he excelled at was impossible. The German army was forced into a static battle of attrition in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy. This terrain favored the defense, allowing the Germans to exact a heavy toll on the advancing Allies. But it was a losing game. Germany could not replace its losses. The Allies could replace every tank and soldier 10 times over. The psychological impact on the German high command was devastating. The myth of the Atlantic Wall had been shattered in less than 24 hours. The concrete bunkers, the millions of mines, and the flooded fields had imposed a cost, but they had not stopped the tide. Rommel, writing to his wife Lucy a few days later, stripped away all optimism. The tone of his letters shifted from the confident energy of the spring to a dark fatalism. He realized that the Second Front was not just a military problem, but the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. As the days passed, the disparity in power became overwhelming. The Allies established airfields in France, bringing their fighter bombers even closer to the front. The naval bombardment from the Channel continued to pulverize German assembly areas miles inland. Rommel found himself commanding an army that was blind, deaf, and immobile, constantly reacting to Allied thrusts rather than dictating the battle. The Desert Fox was trapped in a cage, watching his divisions being ground into dust by a material superiority he had warned Hitler about for months. The consequences of the mistake were now etched into history. Had Rommel been at La Roche-Guyon on the morning of June 6th, had the panzers been released at 4 o'clock instead of 1600 hours, the outcome might have been different. A coordinated armored strike against the struggling Americans at Omaha or the British at Sword in the early hours could have turned the invasion into a disaster. Instead, the vacuum of leadership and the delay in orders allowed the Allies to survive their most vulnerable moment. By mid-June, the front lines had hardened. The opportunity for a German victory in the West had evaporated. The invasion forces were poised to break out into the French interior, aiming for Paris and the Rhine. The Atlantic Wall was a memory, a broken shell left behind on the beaches. The war would drag on for another 11 bloody months, but the decisive turning point had occurred during that brief, storm-tossed window when the defenders looked away. In the final analysis, the fall of Fortress Europe was not just a triumph of Allied valor, but a tragedy of German command. The timeline of errors, the weather forecast, the birthday trip, the sleeping Führer, and the hesitation of the staff conspired to create the perfect storm. Rommel's mistake was not in his tactics, but in his belief that he had time. He thought the invasion was weeks away, but history does not wait for the weather to clear, nor for a field marshal to return from his wife's birthday. The wall was exposed, the door was kicked open, and the world changed forever.